Hello and welcome everyone to this session. I'm delighted to be in conversation with these three authors. But before that, just a little bit about the topic itself. Migration is on the global radar screen these days as a crisis, as an unwelcome intrusion. But it is more. It is about the mobility of people brought about by the intersection of histories, multiple geographies. But viewed from a different perspective, migration is also an individual journey to new terrains. It's about aspirational maps. It's about transplanted lives of nostalgia, finding new ways of belonging, and often through remembering the past. The Indian diaspora has been crossing oceanic routes for centuries, and in their transnational lives and stories, India remains a looming and living force. I have the distinct pleasure of being in conversation with these three writers today, whose books draw creative energy from the diasporic experience in very distinct ways. The characters and storylines capture the realities, the conflicts, the challenges of immigrant life, when sometimes dreams become nightmares, when identities become stereotypes, and when documents like visas and registration cards become proxies for identity. Saras Manickam's book captures the everyday lives of multicultural communities living in Malaysia with high energy and verve. Viji's 912 Batu Road portrays the entanglements in the lives of the Iyer and the Tan family against the backdrop of the Japanese invasion of Malaya. Amrita's The Other Mohan in Britain's Indian Ocean Empire, The Other Mohan in Britain's Indian Ocean Empire, is about a journey to understand another journey taken by her great-grandfather, and many more journeys, each a page-turner. Thank you for the opportunity to engage. In interest of time, I would like to pose three questions, one after the other, to our writers to get a little flavor of the creativity and energy in this short time. So my first question to you, if you want to start, Saras, maybe? Is to tell us a little bit about your book, give us a peek into the book, and perhaps what inspired you, what compelled you to write, maybe the context that drove you, a little peek, as I said, into your books. So we'll start with Amrita.
Thank you, Radha. It's wonderful to be here, and I should point out, though, that I am a non-fiction writer, while both my colleagues here are fiction writers, and so my book is non-fiction. But the impulse was personal. It was a family mystery. As a child, I knew I had a great-grandfather, a maternal great-grandfather called Mohanlal Killawala, who I knew that he had gone to South Africa as a young man and come back. We don't know why he went, but some family members thought it might have had something to do with Gandhi, but we really didn't know for sure. But whatever the reason for which Mohanlal set out, what we do know is that along the way he met a woman, and she produced his child, who would grow up to be my grandmother. But we don't know who the woman was. We don't know where she came from, her age, her name, nothing at all. So this was something that, was, as I was growing up and I became a researcher and a writer, I thought someday I would kind of look into this. And so 2013 is when I began this project. It took me 10 years. It took me to South Africa, to Mauritius, to the UK, and to parts of India. And basically, I was like a detective following clues through the archives, trying to answer these two questions. Why did Mohanlal go overseas? And two, who was my great-grandmother? So, as I said, this was a personal impulse, but I found that my story, when I started researching, was actually a kind of representing a much larger story of migration at that time. So the turn of the 20th century, you saw an unprecedented movement across the world. Europeans were leaving by steamer for the new colonies. Indians were going abroad as indentured workers, and then following them traders, and then following them a few professionals, people who went, educated people who went as teachers or accountants or interpreters and the odd lawyer, and which is why you have Gandhi going in 1893 to work on a case for a Memon trader from Porbandar, his hometown. And similarly, my great-grandfather went, as I discovered, as wanting to be an interpreter. So this was the kind of reality of the time, and I found myself entering this sort of fascinating history. And I write a lot about the sea in this book, and to me it was like India's experience of Western modernity. This was that era, where it was that was what I was entering. And it was like the sea was breaking off pieces of land and making new formations. New societies were coming into being, and new relationships, like for instance, my great-grandfather from a conservative Hindu family, meeting an anonymous woman and producing a child, and then of course a whole family through this. So I thought it represented my personal story, resonated with what was happening at the time.
Viji Krishnamoorthy.
Yes, thank you for having me here as well. Mine is not as deep and profound as what Amrita has described. So mine actually started out in a moment of desperation, actually. So this was about 15, 20 years ago. And I needed to get my husband, a gift. And I had no idea what to get him. So I decided I was going to write a chapter. Very stupidly wrote that chapter, put it in a yellow envelope, and gave it to him. Upon which he said, okay, you've got to do something with this wretched letter in that envelope. So this became a point of actually arguments, debates, because I did not want to be a writer, and he felt that I had a story to tell. So as the years trot on and the kids are getting older, so desperation became duress. And I sat for hours with him, and we sort of plotted and pondered. And so that first chapter, that gift I gave him, basically in some form, is the first chapter in the book of Getting to the Mandapam. And that's written in present-day Malaysia, which is about 2008. So in writing that, so when I had kind of like given into the duress and been, I thought in order to write in the present, I had to return to the past. And that's what took me all the way back to a small little village in Tanjore, Kutur, where actually the story is of it's based on brush strokes of my own memory bank. It would be disingenuous to say that this is completely a work of fiction. So it goes back to Tanjore, where a young man by the name of Rangaswamy Iyer gets on a ship and comes to Malaya. And as I started to write it, then I decided that I also wanted to have a voice that he had somewhere to return as well. So that took place in the form of letters that he wrote to his father in Tanjore. So the past then actually follows the historical pattern of Malaya, and that was the Japanese occupation. So this young man comes to this foreign country, and all his sensibilities are salted by the smells and the flavors of this new land. And so it goes through his friendships, the friendships that he makes with the locals, him trying to find his place in this new country. Of course, he goes back and marries, brings home a wife, happens to be called Saras, from India, and they go on to have 3 children. So the present, then, is a parallel story of the 2 descendants of the main characters in the past, Rangaswamy Iyer and his good friend Chinnam. So their grandchildren fall in love and want to get married. And of course, all hell breaks loose because, we're all very, very agreeable when someone else's family, you have an interracial marriage, that's all very wonderful, we must be inclusive. But heaven forbid if that trespasses your vasapadi and you bring it into your own home. So we have that aspect of cultural identity, of wanting to hold on so desperately to what you have. So then it carries on. I would have to say then you'll have to read the book and find out what happens.
Right. In my case, it's a little bit different. It's like 100 years ago, South Indian laborers came into Malaya to open the jungles, open estates, run the stuff and all that. That was 100 years ago, but they came as dark-skinned South Indians. And that concept of dark-skinned laborers, unskilled, drunk, useless people, has still remained. And it still lives in terms of racial slurs, in terms of racism, discrimination, and all that. Okay, that's a given reality. When I started writing these stories, what I had to learn was, what I had to find out and fight was to see whether I had the courage to write about these things. We are so used to sanitizing our stories so as not to give offense. That would not be fair to the characters. So that would not be fair to the craft of writing a story. I had to find the courage to write honestly, and yet at the same time not write a song, a song to victimhood. I wasn't interested in victims. I was interested in how these people, ordinary people, black-skinned, discriminated against people, found the courage to look at life in the face and decide what they were going to do about it, to stop the whining victimhood, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I just loved what Viji said about the Vasapadi, the inside and the outside, so frame all your narratives, in spite of the different approaches and genres, that there is a sense of identity, of being different and being another. I mean, we are seeing it being played out on the world stage today. Each of you bring up some kind of hierarchy, racialized hierarchies, gendered hierarchies of cultural systems, caste systems that are carried over, or more systemic forms of exclusion. So I'm wondering if you can perhaps take an example or two from your book and speak about how you capture that complexity of identity. I know you're so steeped in the book, but I'm asking you to single out one or two things. Yes. You want to start for a change? Yeah, let's mix up the order a little bit.
Okay. Racism. The word cling, for example, is a racial slur against South Indian dark, useless gangsters, drunks, laborers. And it's a very casual, very comfortable slur, because it makes people feel comfortable. I'm better than you. You can hear me? Right. All right. So, but that it wasn't enough to just write about racial slurs, because we blinking Indians are just as good as others when it comes to bigotry and racism. We give as good as we get. The only difference is in the scale, So I wanted to write about that too, that bigotry is a two-way street. And if you want to write about racism or whatever, you don't write on both sides. Otherwise, it's just a song to victimhood, and I really didn't want to do that. So in many of the stories, you just can't run away from politics and from racism and from discrimination, because that's quite endemic. And so it's like kids grow up and they think they're fine. We are friends. We don't know about racism. But you grow up a little bit, and then you find that one race gets scholarships, gets privileges, and the other one gets nothing or gets very little. What do you do? How do you react? Are you going to sit down and cry and say, look at me, I don't get anything, which doesn't solve any problem? So that was it. Or even the confrontation that you and the person of another race, you're good friends, but in the end, that friend casts a racial slur at you, calls you a cling, and then your balance is all gone. How do you respond? What do you do? Yeah.
Shall I just use yours? So mine, I think you find this whole question of identity very much present in the present chapters of the book. Because it's generational as well as cultural. So you'll see that Geeta is the daughter of Ramesh and Parvati. And they are very traditional Tamils, so their identity is Tamil. And in a country like Malaysia, we always identify ourselves as I'm Indian, Malaysian Indian, or Tamil Indian. Yeah, when we're overseas, we always say we're Malaysian. But within our home, domestically, we're identified by our race. So for Parvati and Ramesh, they were definitely identified more as Tamils. So they were Tamils first and then only Malaysians. Whereas for Geeta, she was Malaysian. In her head, she was Malaysian first. And so for them, it was a very clear distinction of, yes, you may have this education, you may have gone overseas, but you still abide by customs. You still have to do what we think is best for you. And of course, as your parents, we know what's best for you. So there's that huge cultural divide, and there's also that whole rustle-tussle of the generation of her trying to straddle two worlds, and Parvati trying to understand that chasm between them.
Okay. So yes, I mean racism, because my book takes place around the time of Gandhi Satyagraha, so of course it's very much, this was the period in which the white colonies were getting autonomous. And so because they were getting autonomous, they were trying to create the society they wanted through laws, which limited the progress, the economic progress of Indians, the movement of Indians, and also the entry of new Indians. So they were passing all these laws. It started in the late 1800s. And then you had resistance in the form of people like Gandhi, who started a campaign against these laws. But you also had resistance, and I like what Saras said about not being the victim. I think my book deals, because as I said, this is the period of Gandhi Satyagraha, so the reality is these racist laws being kind of created, and things like, for instance, people at the ports, so in Cape Town, for instance, writing saying, a big shipload of Indians are coming, and then the editorials would be, oh, the vermin are coming, or, this panic almost. And then, of course, that very famous incident when in Durban, a similar rumor spread that Gandhi was bringing laborers to work from India. And so you had actually an attack on him, a murderous attack on him. So this was the situation. But I think because my entry point for this book is the other Mohan, it's not Gandhi. My great-grandfather was also called, he was called Mohan Lal, similar to Mohandas Gandhi. And so the other Mohan provided me an entry point into forms of resistance, which I have not actually seen very much about. I've not read very much about, but the archives is just full of these glorious descriptions of, illegalities committed by Indians to kind of get around these laws, these restrictive laws. So for instance, let's say at the borders, I found the story of an interpreter who was offering a policeman 2 rupees. I'll put a silk handkerchief and I'll give you 2 rupees if you let that person in, that kind of arrangement. And then for instance, getting people through the borders of the ships posing as fake family members. And then when they would arrive, there would be someone, the agent would be on at the port waving a handkerchief so that, he would say, oh, that is my father, because actually he isn't his father at all. So my book, I think, deals with all these forms of resistance, which is slightly an alternative to the Gandhi story.
It's so interesting how so many of these issues that you raise about survival, about oceanic journeys, about agency and activism get repeated in different contexts. There's so much to talk about here. But let's move on to another question. As writers, you must have all grappled with the issue of readership, given the sort of transnational scope of the storyline that you're working with. There's always a question whether immigrant stories appeal to broader audiences. And so who was the reader in your mind when you wrote these stories or when you did your historical and archival research? Do you want to start?
Considering I didn't want to write this book, so in my head, I didn't have any readers really in mind. So it would have been probably me, my sister, my husband, maybe some very close friends who actually had read that book and they're in the audience here today. And so it didn't get past, I didn't think anybody would be interested in reading this book. But once it had kind of like, been put out in the world, then I think I got a little bit greedy. And I thought, well, okay, so maybe Malaysians should be interested in reading this book because they really ought to know about certain characters in the book, historical characters who lived and who contributed, but whom are obliterated from our history books. They should be interested to find out a little bit more about the true history. And then I thought, hang on a minute. So this is a story about this wonderful Rangaswamy who comes from Tanjore, Kutur, to be specific, who comes to Malaya. Surely the subcontinent would be interested in these stories. And so I kept getting a little bit greedy, and here I am today. And I just want to give a little shout out that I studied in a school literally around the corner from here called Vidyodaya. So for me, this is really like coming full circle. So I think our stories are really important to be heard, and I think you need to tell these stories because we're all migrants, we're all moving through space and time. And in only reading other people's stories, can you really pierce that whole, our own myopic views of others, isn't it? When you read other people's stories and there's empathy, then you understand other perspectives. So I think, so I'm a greedy girl.
Time for truth. There was no question of a reader. You see, I fancied myself a writer. So when I wanted to write about these topics, part of it was showing off. I need to show people how clever I am. That kind of, part of it is that ego. I had to learn to push that ego aside, because I'm telling a story that really is about characters and places, and they kept telling me, shut up, move, move, move. You're only the channel for our stories. So every time I tried to manipulate the story to show how clever I am, the story failed. And every time I tried to manipulate the story to peddle morality or some higher thing, it didn't work. So apart from I didn't think about readers. I thought about honoring the craft of telling a story as honestly as possible, as authentically as possible, so that would come across, that would tell the story, that would carry the theme. And after that, I thought, if it's really a very good story, there will be a reader for it. And I did have a reader from the Bronx at a Zoom meeting. He said, man, you're writing about my mother. So it was not the reader. I was just concerned that the craft of writing, I had to stay true to that craft of authenticity, honesty, and telling both sides of the story so that you don't just scream victimhood and patriarchy. And always the abuser can also be a victim. I needed to be fair. And that was the thing in my mind.
I'm actually surprised that there has been interest from the diaspora, I mean the wider diaspora, not just from the Western Indian Ocean that I write about. Because I didn't see myself writing about the diaspora, because I'm in this peculiar, stories about the diaspora usually emerge from the diaspora. But I'm an Indian living in India, and I just went to learn about this history for other reasons. So I actually saw my book as a book about origins. It's an origin story. And so I thought that's pretty universal, because I think I've met so many people. Everyone tells me, oh, I had this wayward uncle who went off and did something, or there's always a mystery in every family. And I think my book would sort of appeal to that impulse to to find out more about your past. But also I think I had a little project in mind, which in terms of style, Saras talks about craft. And I think what I wanted to write was an adventure story. you know, like the colonizer used to write, like the explorer going off, like E. Rider Haggard in King Solomon's Mines, or you know, Dr. Livingston, Stanley on Dr. Livingston. And I thought, you know, I'm a woman and I'm a post-colonial woman and I want to write my adventure story. So I think it would appeal to anyone who's interested in creative nonfiction in that sense, because I was having a bit of fun with that too. I think I wrote an adventure story.
Thank you so much. These 3 books are so rich that to ask you to summarize this seems to be almost unfair, but thank you very much. Just to get the audience a little more flavor of your books, I was just wondering, Saras, I just marked out a few things in your book which I had truly enjoyed reading. Somewhere on page 138, you say, growing up in a multicultural society as children, and the reality that emerges later. You talk about that. But essentially to say that diversity was only celebrated during elections, which those of you who know of other societies too, is that happens. So I'm just wondering, given the time, if you can speak to just the issue. 138, I have it all marked for you. Here. Yeah.
Shall I read it?
You can read it or speak to it, your call.
Let me just read that very small paragraph so you know where it's coming from. Growing up inseparable, always running in and out of each other's homes, playing on the corridor together, Shankar, Azam, and I, we could have been poster kids to celebrate a diverse Malaysia. Only diversity wasn't celebrated, except during elections. This was true for the longest time, as in children growing up not really understanding about race, religion, but I don't think it is the same for now. We grew up literally running in and out of each other's houses, eating food from the neighbors. You know, there's a scene where Amin comes and eats sambar. He's a Chinese, and he always comes during lunchtime in one of the other stories. It doesn't happen like that anymore because race and religion, they're like the serpent inside your stomach that have awoken. And so is the food halal? Is it this? Is it that? You know, so children don't really eat in each other's homes anymore unless you can guarantee that it's people. My friends come to my house, they'll drink packet milk, packet drinks. Now, these are friends who used to eat with me. They don't do that anymore. So the reality is different because of race and religion and politics taking over, right? So, the situation is, you know, it's evil. I can't think of a better word, where kids look at you and see an Indian or a Kling, you know, or they see a Chinese and they say useless Babi. Babi means pig, which is the ultimate insult. Or even if you look at a Malay and say, oh, you lazy fellow. So many assumptions that are seeping down even to the children. Yeah.
Thank you. Viji, early in the book, you write about the sons of the Iyer family being in different countries. Suresh is an ENT surgeon in Manchester, Ravi an aeronautical engineer in Houston. It's a marvelous capturing of the dispersal of the Indian diaspora, right? Going to England and then going to the US, and just there's a sort of a labor history right there. So why was that important for you as a, I was going to say novelist, but I know you characterize yourself differently. Yes. Why was it important for you to include that detail, that nuance?
Because that is the reality, really. Most of us want to, I mean, I come from a family where, you know, first you want to be a doctor, and if you don't get the grades for that, then you do law, and if you still can't get the grades for that, then, maybe something in the sciences, or maybe an accountant. God forbid you want to do interior design, all of that is out the window. So all of this just shows you how far you want your young to go. And this is a very Malaysian thing, where you have my grandfather's generation, for example, left India for a better future to come to Malaya and try and build a life. And in 2 generations, we as Malaysians are now sending our children off into the, to England and America and Australia and Singapore to become citizens of other countries, because the opportunities that we have as non-Malays is very limited. So this is a true reflection of what actually happens in Malaysia. I don't have my reading glasses.
That's okay. Thank you, Viji. Amrita, in your book, there's powerful writing. This is a book, as Amrita mentioned, which is a part memoir. It's a very well-researched book. Towards the end, you wonder why your ancestor, who shares a name with the other Mohan, what moved your ancestor to write letters after a while about racial discrimination that he might have faced, and what was the power of the other Mohan in your Mohan's life? So there's this, if you want to talk about that, how did the experience of one Mohan gain meaning and action from the vision of the other? And those are not my words, it's yours. So if you want to, it's right here. If you want to just speak to it or read it, it's so beautifully written.
I'll read a bit, but I think I know what the question sort of is about. And in the last section, when I left Mohanlal gravitating towards the Satyagraha movement, I assumed that the adventurous interpreter had been affected by a recent sensitivity to racial injustice. His letters to colonial authorities complaining of mistreatment as an Indian, followed by his actual participation in the protest campaign, suggested that he had been moved by Gandhi, whose ability to inspire people was legendary. Eric Erickson, I quote him saying that, Gandhi made people feel augmented in his presence. This is what, and I write, that is what I believed had happened. Mohanlal's experience of racial discrimination had coalesced with Gandhi's vision. The 2 Mohans had become one. So to briefly explain, this book, all through the book, I'm not quite sure about what my great-grandfather Mohanlal had to do with Gandhi. I mean, I know that he joined the Satyagraha movement and he was arrested. But in his later life, he was someone who was English-speaking, wore a suit, smoked cigarettes, ate porridge for breakfast, which is so unlike a normal Gujarati breakfast. So he was very English in many ways. And I thought this is not so Gandhian. And so I was always sort of leery. But when I started researching, I come across letters he has written complaining that, the authorities have discriminated against him, they've done this, they've done that, and, they've kept his luggage, and they should not behave like this with Indians, all this. So this is the passage where I think the 2 have become one, that maybe despite his own inclinations, Mohanlal has become like Mohandas. But of course, that's not what I found had happened. I think Mohanlal was a total opportunist. And I mean, it's a bit left a bit kind of unexplained and a little ambiguous because there's room for influence. But I think this is another, you see, because the kind of Indians who went abroad were adventurous. They went for opportunity. And I think that is the strain that develops through my story, my reading.
Thank you. Maybe in terms of time, I'll ask you one last question, which arises organically from your comments. I think, Saras, you mentioned that these characters, in a sense, write themselves. All your work has this panoply of characters, so many actors involved, from time frames, from geographies. So I was just wondering, is that true? Did the characters sort of have a runaway life through your creativity?
I can just give one example. Sure. The title story, My Mother Pattu, I took the longest time to write it. Not because I'm a dinosaur, which I am, but also because I must have written about a gazillion drafts. But they all failed because I was trying to punish Pattu. Pattu was a horrible woman, but she was also a great friend. And she was a very complex, complicated character. But I was interested in just showing her up as an awful person and to punish her. So gazillion drafts, the stories were shit. I had to learn to forgive her and to forgive myself for wanting to hate her. And when that was done, then the story came honestly. Then Pattu emerged as a really complicated, complex person who hates her daughter, but who also is a wonderful friend, attractive, great, sexy lover, but she had so much going for her. But there was this rage in her. I had to learn to talk about the rage without preaching about it. So, yeah.
There is a theme of rage and motherhood,
A
right?
lot of it, yeah. Because the women at the end of it really, however educated they were, did not have agency. Pattu didn't have agency over her life, so the rage, but she was not allowed to study or move on. We also had, educated professional women, and the husband would come and tell them, maybe you should stop working. I mean, I'm earning enough, as if that's the only reason why you work. So the rage is there. How the women handle that rage, and or not handle it, like the migrant women,
right,
who came as servants, maids, and were treated barbarically by the people. But at the same time, the men, the family back at home in Indonesia, elsewhere, they were very comfortably expecting money to come in, and they didn't want to understand that this woman was suffering, was being abused. They didn't want to know that because the money was just too good. So, yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead.
The same sort of...
Yeah, the characters.
I think mine, in a way, I got to play a little bit of God, because then, I could sort of like decide what I wanted them to do, and they were quite organic. So I wasn't extremely organized or disciplined about, how I was going to write them out. I think, like, to a large extent, what Sarah says, they do take over, they do lend their own characters and personalities. But I did get to play God, so I did get to maneuver them a little bit and tweak them, or the likes and the dislikes, and yeah. So they, so I had a bit more of a hand. They were a little bit more putty, maybe.
Okay. My cast of characters that you've assembled.
So my restriction, if you could say, is that I insist on everything being fact-checked. I mean, so everything. I mean, even if my characters, not characters, the people are going on a journey, and I'm trying to make it literary by saying the moon was up, then I actually checked if the moon was actually up that night, So I was restricted by fact, and I was happily restricted by fact. But that did mean that I had to have a lot of fact. As much as I could collect of the time, so I was looking at scholarly papers of all kinds, people, what ships they owned, what businesses they were into, and small little details would come up which were wonderful. So for instance, the early traders who went from Western India were mostly sort of semi-literate or illiterate, but they were poor people who just cut up they cut up these tin trunks to make suitcases and flung some clothes in and just took off, and then once they got there, they built these empires actually in South Africa and Mauritius. They traded in sugar, they traded in, they even started going to England to buy fashion goods for the ladies, the British ladies. So they were very, very resourceful. And then you see a new generation coming, and the way I would see, I was told there, so I read somewhere, someone's son, he had now gone all over the world, and he started wearing suits while the others would wear their pajamas. And, so I used all this to create the atmosphere to create characters. I mean, as I said, I didn't add anything. I just wrote it in a way that was not sort of scholarly or, you know, academic or like a, you could read it like a story.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we're just perfectly in time. We have about a little short of 10 minutes for questions. Yes, Hema.
The question really is about, I guess, Malaysia, primarily about how the politics and the political structures influenced your stories, if they did, and the lives of your characters.
Definitely. You can't run away from politics of race, religion in Malaysia. If you did that, you wouldn't have an honest story, you know? So, yes. And I was petrified when I was writing because, you know, you're so used to self-censorship. But at the same time, you can't run away from the fact that lots of Indians are gangsters, lots of Indians came in as laborers, and you also have to write about that. So the politics of it is a very funny animal because it's got all these aspects. And I wanted to write, if you're not honest if you're just writing about victims. You know, it's like in one small dialogue, this mother says, yeah, you did nothing, you were just a clerk. But yeah, what can you do? Wrong race, wrong religion. But you didn't do anything, you know? So yeah, stuff like this. I don't know whether this answers your questions.
Yes, please.
Yes, this is Mohammed Nazib, professor, assistant professor, New College. Thank you, ma'am. This is my research area. Migration studies is something like, it brings new perspectives based on people in South India where they haven't got that much gravity of pain and also the challenges. So thanks for giving more inputs. As a women, what's your opinion or how far you have done the profound way of research in your work? And I'm talking about the feminine point of view, where the current scenarios in Syria, Palestine, and other nations. As a woman, how much is a tough thing when migration happens in the present time? Thank you.
Perhaps we can, thank you for your question. Perhaps we can qualify it to the context of your stories, if that is okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
So women and migration.
I just want to say something. I'm not sure that applies to your question because not specifically about women, but I think what I found as a background to the current migration patterns and what they're calling the refugee crisis, I found it quite interesting that when I was studying how the colonial laws were being framed in South Africa to restrict entry of people who are sort of undesirable, it was so many categories. You know, it was, of course, the Indians were primarily because they were scared they would flood in large numbers. So this whole terminology, you know, flooding and so this whole idea of, yeah, hordes and, but they were also not friendly to East Europeans, not friendly to Jews. There was a whole hierarchy of who was a desirable and, you know, immigrant and who was not. So, and women, I mean, women really, if they came unaccompanied, they were just assumed to be prostitutes and not allowed in. So, you know, that's my two bit for.
Do one of you want to take a shot at it?
No, The only thing I want to say is in terms of research, you mentioned being fact-checking. I did that too. So because you're writing about, let's say you're writing about discrimination, or you're writing about women, you're writing about mates being abused, you jolly well better get some facts. So like Indian men being arrested, then a couple of days later they die of perforated stomach ulcers. Okay, that was I get all the facts, because all the newspapers to back up. You had to be very sure about what you're saying.
Just to add to your, the question about gender, I think in almost every society that women have migrated to, mostly as dependents typically, there have been layerings of patriarchal structures, right? So the patriarchal structure that one carries from India gets redoubled in the name of maintaining tradition. So that sort of thing happens, and also outright structural issues, you know, for example, anyway, I don't want to get too detailed, but there are structural issues as well. Is there any other question for our writers here? Well then, thank you very, very much for this wonderful work of creativity. An applause, I think, for our writers. And thank you very much for your attention and your being here. Thank you.